It's time for you to improve your team on the waiver wire before week 9 begins, because you are quickly getting close to your fantasy postseason, and there's a couple guys still on the waiver wire who are potential league winners. And in this video, we're going to break down exactly who those 10 players are who can help you get to the fantasy playoffs and win your league. And we'll start with this guy right here, Cedric Tillman, who we mentioned last week in this video, but he's still available in an absurd 80% of leagues. And look, we discussed it last week, the Browns wide receiver, the second-year player, a young guy. He comes out last week without Amari Cooper in his first game, plays 82% of the snaps according to Fantasy Life. What does this translate to? A team high 24% target share. Okay, that was obviously fantastic. He ended up having 12 targets in that game. He put up a big performance, and he played with 3 different quarterbacks in week 7. So it was a little bit wonky, like who actually likes Cedric Tillman in terms of the quarterback room. But he was able to earn targets from all 3 of those quarterbacks. Deshaun Watson before injury, DTR before injury, and then Jameis Winston on the final drive of the game. And this translated to an 18-point day. Sure, it was a nice matchup against the Bengals, but 8 catches for 81 yards. It was honestly like the best performance we've seen outside of Amari Cooper for a Browns receiver all year long. And it was nice to see Tillman, who had some preseason hype, it actually came through in week 7, and he played immediately over Elijah Moore. So he was a starter right away. And that's exactly why we were like, yeah, you should probably add this guy. He's a talented guy. He has good size, speed, great college profile before his injury. And then in week 8, he comes out, and what do you know? Once again, he plays the second most snaps on the team, just 5 behind Jerry Jeudy according to PFF. Just 3 less routes than Jerry Jeudy for the team lead. And he ended up earning 9 targets in this game. Once again, a 24% target share, and it led to another big day, an even bigger day, because he ended up finding the end zone. Catches 7 to 9 targets, 99 yards, and another nice matchup against Baltimore, but this is what you're supposed to do, dominate nice matchups. 2 touchdowns, including the game winner late with like less than a minute to go, and 29 fantasy points. So what you're getting right now is a potential, and I'm going to say this and not try and sound crazy here, a potential wide receiver 1 on the Browns on an offense that is improving very quickly, and a guy that could be like a flex top 24 wide receiver weekly moving forward. Because he's seen a 24% target share in back-to-back games, and look at this right here from Dwayne McFarland on Twitter. This is a 39% air yard share. So he saw 40% of the team's air yards. So this is not only a guy seeing targets, he's seeing targets downfield, which are much more valuable for fantasy and just producing big gains of 20 plus yards and those touchdowns like we saw this past game. So now over his past 2 games without Amari Cooper, Tillman has 15 catches, 180 yards, and 2 touchdowns on 11 targets per game, people. And look, there's just no way, absolutely no way Jameis Winston isn't the starter moving forward. You knock off the best team in football, the Baltimore Ravens, a rival. He goes out there, leads your team to victory in dramatic fashion, plays great as well. I mean, the guy's popping off for over 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. There's no way you take that away from the fan base that has just been, I mean, in agony this year, because the Browns did say, oh, we're going to go back to DTR when healthy. No way that's happening now. Tillman is now Jameis Winston's #1 outside receiver. And just ask how Mike Evans, ask him how that went in the past. Ask Chris Godwin how that went in the past. Those guys had career seasons with Jameis Winston throwing him the ball. Now, if you're not familiar, as I hinted at earlier, a nice size wide receiver, 6'3", 213 pounds. The exact guy that Jameis has liked his entire time, even dating back to his college career ball. You can go over here to his athletic testing, 79th percentile speed, 79th percentile burst according to Player Profiler. Nice catch radius. Like, all of this is fantastic, and you can even drop down to what he did in college. Now, he had not a wonky college career, but it could have been, if I'm being honest with you fellas, it could have been a lot better for him, but injuries do happen. He spent 5 years in college. You can see he was breaking out in this season over 1,000 yards. He had 24% target share. He was doing this at Tennessee, and then his final year, he only plays 6 games, suffers an injury, just 417 yards. But in that year, he was starting to break out in his final year and having pacing for a better year than the season before. So he was looking like a guy getting 1,000 yards in back-to-back seasons. He actually was outproducing a guy in Jalen Hyatt in 2021 over 1,000 yards. Hyatt, you know very well, had a fantastic final year in college. He ended up getting drafted pretty early to the New York Giants, and since then hasn't done much. But Tillman was actually the best receiver on that team before injury. So I think he's arguably like a top 24 wide receiver. We're talking the weeks that have bye weeks for fantasy football. You need to add him, but he's not the only Browns receiver we got to talk about here, people. Because what do you know? Elijah Moore is still kicking in fantasy. The guy that everybody wanted to be a thing when he was signed as a second-round pick or drafted in 2021 by the New York Jets, and then Zach Wilson basically tanked this guy's career and anything else attached to that team. Well, this guy's available in 98% of waiver wire leagues. So if Tillman, who's available in 82%, is not available for you, maybe Elijah Moore is, and he's not the worst at. Because last week in his first game without Amari Cooper and having those 3 different quarterbacks in week 7, you know, it was a decent game. Nothing crazy here. Nothing that I really felt the need to recommend. 10 fantasy points, 6 catches on 41 yards, 7 targets. Okay, like that's great, but we already knew that Tillman had a big game last week. David Njoku was highly involved. How many people could really be sustained in this Browns offense until we got the news that Jameis was starting, and Jameis did Jameis things. Because the usage was there for Elijah Moore in week 7. 70% of the routes and a 15% target share was like basically his best on the season. Maybe one other game he saw better usage this year, but as I was mentioning, like, look at all this competition he has to deal with. You still have Jerry Jeudy, of course, there. He's running a lot of routes, seeing snaps, and earning targets. Tillman Tillman, and then David Njoku. Like, can we really trust a potential third or fourth passing game option on this Cleveland Browns offense? The answer was no until this past week with Jameis Winston, because once again, we get good usage out of Elijah Moore. 49 snaps for him. We know he's the slot wide receiver on this team. He's never going to play 80%, 90% of the snaps barring an injury. So he sees 40, or he sees about 60 to 70% of the snaps. But look at this right here, 12 targets according to PFF. Those 12 targets meant that he earned a 32% target share from Jameis Winston, the most on the team, ahead of David Njoku, ahead of Cedric Tillman, ahead of Jerry Jeudy. And this translated to a nice fantasy day, one that we now have to mention, of 16.5 fantasy points, 8 catches for 85 yards. Was actually seeing some downfield usage, not just like these 5-yard passes, which would be a big concern for me, but was seeing some downfield usage. We know he has that in his skill set from both his college and his early season NFL careers, and you can see the 12 targets right here. So all this is good, but we do have to add some context. One, they were facing the Baltimore Ravens, arguably and probably is the worst secondary right now in terms of fantasy production they allow, and they just leak fantasy points and yardage and all of this in trailing game scripts because they're usually leading in games. So that led to Jameis Winston throwing 41 times, which I'm not sure, based on the Browns defense, that is, hit or miss depending on the matchup, but in better matchups when they're not facing the Ravens offense, I'm not sure that Jameis is going to throw 41 times a game. We know, though, the good thing is, if we add some even more context, the Browns do want to throw the ball because I don't think they want to lean on Nick Chubb like they used to for 20 to 20 plus touches a game, and then we know Jameis Winston wants to throw the ball. So although this 41 pass attempts is probably an outlier, I do think we still see 30 to 35 per game, so that's nice because that does give you, even if you get a 20% target share out of Elijah Moore in some weeks, the floor of like a 5 to 6 target performance with the ceiling of this 12 targets we saw the past week. So now all of a sudden it's a crowded wide receiver room. Even Jerry Jeudy's available in like I think 50% of leagues. So if he's out there, he's a priority too. I think the priorities in this offense right now are in this ranking order for me. Number 1 rest of season is going to be David Njoku. Number 2, Cedric Tillman. And then number 3, it's like a toss-up between Jerry Jeudy and Elijah Moore. See how this room kind of just clears itself out or works itself out. So I'd be adding both of them in fantasy right now. Especially Moore, who's available in 98% of leagues and clearly looked like Jameis Winston's security blanket, the guy that he went to when he needed a big play on third down or just kind of needed a guy he could rely on under pressure. Now, I get the question all the time, where do those players rank amongst all the other players available on the waivers? And that's why I made this right here, the waiver wire tiers. You can see the quarterback and tight end tiers for this week are already up, sent out. And if I was to scroll over, you'd see like the 27 names at wide receiver ranked, the 20 names at running back, and you can get access to this along with 21,000 other people as well, which is a part of my fantasy blueprint. It's very simple to get access. You just follow these 2 steps right here. There'll be a link in the description below. You click the get access button and it takes you to this page where you have the options of 2 different partners to sign up for to get the blueprint, because when you sign up through a partner this year, it becomes absolutely risk-free through one of our 2 partners, as you can see right here. Now, what does that mean? It's a one-time payment of $10 when you sign up through one of those 2 partners of mine, and if you don't make your fantasy playoffs, you get that $10 right back. Just reach out, no questions asked. That's why this is risk-free. So if you want to get access to my waiver wire tiers, my rest of season trades tool, my weekly rankings and projections, matchup notes, and a whole lot more, you can just scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below. I'm only running this offer for probably about 1 to 2 more weeks, and then it's done until next year. So be sure to take advantage. Again, this is completely risk-free. Don't you want to schmack your league mates around? Go ahead and do it with the blueprint. The next guy we got to talk about is going to the Jacksonville Jaguars. Their second-year receiver out of Penn State, a 6th-round pick. He's all of a sudden, Parker Washington, become more appealing, and it's because why? The entire, and I'm not trying to speak out of like go crazy here and make this more than it is. The entire Jaguars wide receiver core went down with injury in week 8. Yeah, not great, Bob. Not great at all. I mean, check this out right here. Brian Thomas with a chest injury. Now they're calling it a rib injury. We'll see what happens there. We don't have an update on him. Christian Kirk reportedly is going to miss the entire rest of the season. Left this game and did not come back with a shoulder injury. Gabe Davis left with a shoulder injury earlier on and did not come back. We don't have updates as of this recording on Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas, and the early reports are that Christian Kirk's going to miss the year. So at the very least, we know that Christian Kirk, somebody who's the starting slot receiver, playing 70% of the snaps on this team, he's now done for the year, and there's even a chance that their outside receivers, Brian Thomas and Gabe Davis, miss some time, which is exactly why Parker Washington is in this YouTube video right now. Parker Washington led the team because of all these injuries with 42% of the snaps, 25 routes, and he saw 4 targets in this game. Now, 4 targets is nothing crazy. He ended up turning that into a performance of, let's just pull it up here, 3 catches for 46 yards on these 4 targets. But again, this is a game where he was not expecting to be more involved. He was not game planned in. He probably didn't get a ton of reps with the starters compared to the other guys who went down in this game. So 7.6 fantasy points is not something that I'd be saying like, oh yeah, Parker Washington's not going to do anything for you. I don't believe that's true, because now he'll have time to actually practice with the starters with Christian Kirk potentially and likely, as reports say, done for the year. And also, we saw Parker Washington had glimpses of success last year as a 6th-round rookie. He filled in at times due to injuries. In this game right here, I believe it was week 13 against the Bengals, he has 18 points, 6 catches, 61 yards, and a touchdown. He's a bigger wide receiver. That kind of shows based on the way that he plays, but he can also get open downfield. He has some nice size, he has some nice speed, and he also had multiple weeks where he found the end zone as well, not just that week that I just showed in his rookie year. Look, we really need more reporting here, because if Brian Thomas and Gabe Davis are healthy, those guys will still be the priorities. There's still Evan Ingram in this offense, so I wouldn't be going and blowing your fab budget on Parker Washington. But at this point in the season, where there's not much left on many waiver wires, especially if you're in a competitive league, if we just get news that Gabe Davis is going to miss a couple of weeks, it's a shoulder injury, maybe a week or two with an AC joint sprain, if Brian Thomas with ribs is forced to miss a week or two, that's where Parker Washington and an offense that is throwing the ball a lot, their defense is terrible, they're in a lot of spots where they have to drop back and throw 35 to 40 to 45 times, Parker Washington starts to become a guy that might earn 7 to 10 targets in a game. That could spike just based on that usage if he finds the end zone for a 20-point fantasy performance at some point in the next few weeks, and you might need that, especially during the bye weeks. Somebody worth adding. Another player worth adding is Braelon Allen, and I know we've talked about him a lot this season, but this is a guy that was dropped almost the most out of any running back the last 2 weeks because his usage completely dropped off a cliff. I mean, he was available in only like 30% of leagues. Now he's available in 70% of leagues because the last 2 weeks with a brand new coach, it's been the Breece Hall show, nothing to do with Braelon Allen. He hasn't been involved. So much so that Breece Hall is starting to become like the #1 overall ranked player for a lot of people the rest of the season, while Braelon Allen has been getting dropped. And just kind of a sample of this, you can see from Dwayne McFarland, the massive role on their new Jets coaching staff. You can see right here for Breece Hall, these last 2 weeks, this was before week 8, week 6 and week 7, 85% of the snaps, 83% of the rush attempts. I mean, these numbers were closer to like 70, high 60s, 76% of the routes, 22% of the targets. That would lead the NFL amongst running backs this year. Basically, he was having the best role out of any running back in all of football these last 2 weeks until week 8. And I'm going to show you exactly what happened in week 8, but before we can do that, I have to let you know how this kind of hurt Braelon Allen. Braelon Allen was playing 30% of the snaps. He was earning 9 opportunities per game. For a rookie running back playing behind Breece Hall, 9 opportunities per game and 30 to 40% of the snaps, depending on the week, is strong. But with the new Jets coaching staff, the last 2 weeks, here's what it dropped to from Braelon Allen. It went from 30% of the snaps and 8.6 opportunities per game his first 5 games to just 14% of the snaps and 4 opportunities per game these last 2 weeks with the new Jets coaching staff. But in week 8, we got to see his usage bounce back. He sees 19 snaps here. That was 31% of the snaps. And more importantly, if we go over to his usage, he ended up playing in this game 12 carries he ended up earning, 32 yards and a touchdown, 12 carries in this backfield compared to, I believe, 18 that Breece Hall had. So that's great. We're now back to a spot where he finds the end zone. He gets 9 fantasy points. Okay, like the 9 fantasy points, whatever. But the point being here is now he's at the spot where he can be on your roster as a weekly flex option if you're in a deeper league needing a bye week filler. But more importantly, he's getting the usage. If anything happens to Breece Hall, you now get that elite usage going to Braelon Allen, who in my opinion might be the best handcuff in fantasy football. So the rookie saw 43% of the backfield carries this past week. If Breece Hall was to miss any times, you're getting a spot where you get maybe 20 plus opportunities per game for a guy who can pass protect, who can run in between the tackles, is a monster size-wise, has burst, and also can pass catch, as we've seen earlier this year. Now the next situation we got to talk about is the Houston Texans wide receiver room, because look, I mean, just injuries continue to happen here. And this past week, it ended up happening to Stefon Diggs. We already know that Nico Collins is going to miss more time, but Stefon Diggs, very high concern for an ACL tear, according to SportsMD Analysis on Twitter. He walked off under his own power, but that doesn't mean that it's still intact. So as of right now, it's believed that there's an ACL tear for Stefon Diggs. It's not confirmed as of this recording, so by the time you're watching this, you will know for sure, but we're assuming for this video that it is a torn ACL. And as I said earlier, like, Nico Collins is still going to miss at least one more week on the IR, and look, there's no guarantee that he just comes back in week 10 like I expect him to, but this was a hamstring injury that he re-injured. It looked pretty severe. There's a chance that it lingers a little longer. But more importantly, this team plays on week 9. They play on week 9 on a short week. They don't have Nico Collins. They definitely won't have Stefon Diggs, even if the injury isn't a torn ACL. So now they're down their top 2 wide receivers, and they're going into a short week on the road against a good Jets secondary. Like, it's not a great spot, but it does open up the idea of, okay, deeper leagues, spots where we need a flex week, maybe somebody to fill in for another injured player on your team, who starts to come through. We look at the rest of the receivers here. Second-year player Xavier Hutchinson, John Mechie, a former second-round pick for this team, and then a couple of veterans in Steven Sims, and Robert Woods is the name that you'll know more, Robert Woods. So, okay, none of these guys really scream out like that's going to be a league winner rest of the season, especially since we assume Nico Collins comes back in a few weeks. So I'm not trying to give any crazy amount of fab budget here, but if you need a filler for week 9 and maybe a guy for week 10 if Nico's not 100%, let's try and break this down. We could start with Xavier Hutchinson, who we've talked about in the past on this channel, and he was the guy who kind of came in and saw the most usage on this offense when we saw Stefon Diggs go down. He ends up running the second most routes, playing the second most snaps on the team behind Tank Dell, but it only leads to 1 target. And this has kind of been the story of Xavier Hutchinson this year. He's seen increased usage a couple of times. Tank Dell missed a game earlier this year. Hutchinson goes in, doesn't get a lot of targets, but it makes sense when you're competing with guys like Nico Collins, Stefon Diggs, and Tank Dell. They're going to probably be the guys who earn targets ahead of you. But he was still the guy running the routes, 62% of the snaps, ran 26 routes. Okay, so who's after that here, right? We got a guy in Robert Woods on this page who's an older wide receiver at this point, and based on his film, does not look all that good. We get a guy in John Mechie, who in my opinion is actually somebody that I would be interested in long term. This is a guy who this past week earned 4 targets compared to just 2 for Robert Woods, and long-term meaning like the next couple of weeks and maybe the rest of the season, because John Mechie is actually a guy, in my opinion, who has some pedigree. I mean, this is a guy from Alabama who was a second-round pick, whose career started with a knee injury, it ended Alabama with a knee injury, came into the NFL with that knee injury, rehabbing it, and then finds out that he has cancer. So, of course, that's going to be something that drops you down at least a year in your progression. And unfortunately for John Mechie, we then ended up seeing the team, obviously, Nico Collins breaks out, they assign Stephon Diggs, and Tank Dell becomes a thing in his rookie year. So kind of John Mechie is the afterthought now on this offense, but maybe in the next week or two, he can actually get some usage and show why he was a second-round pick out of Alabama, a very talented prospect at that. Now, in terms of Xavier Hutchinson, I'll remind you from a few weeks back, nice size, 203 pounds, 6'2". You scroll down to his college career. Last year in his final year of college, he was actually a finalist for the best wide receiver, the Biletnikoff Award, because of this season right here. He earns 163 targets, over 100 catches. He ends up seeing a 34% target share, 1,200 yards. This is on an offense that's really not doing much. Iowa State, like, this is not like the most potent offense in the NFL, and you get Xavier Hutchinson going out here and producing a finalist, one of the 3 best wide receivers in the country that season. So that now coming into this Texans offense is interesting as well for this short week game in week 9. If I had to choose right now, I would rank it Xavier Hutchinson, then John Mechie as waiver wire ads. They're both available in 99% of leagues. So based on your league, who else is available? If the other guys we've already mentioned are gone, those are some guys worth considering. But this next rookie wide receiver is more of a priority ad than those guys I just mentioned. But before we get there, 65% of you are not subscribed to the YouTube channel. Real quick right here, gentleman's agreement. We shake on it. If you find this video helpful, entertaining, engaging, whatever it might be, all you got to do is hit the subscribe button. It takes like 6 to 8 hours to put these videos together, and all you have to do in return, if you enjoy them and you want them to keep coming out, especially this time of year where it's hard to get a bunch out, just hit that subscribe button. Now, that rookie I'm talking about is Keon Coleman, who we discussed him last week. He had a big week. He ended up having over 100 yards, and we said go add the rookie, and now he's still available though in 60% of leagues, despite that big week last week. We're in his first game with Amari Cooper. When Cooper ends up turning out, wasn't on the field for any of these 7 targets, but still, you had the first game with Amari, Keon Coleman, 4 catches, 125 yards, goes for 19.5 fantasy points. We mentioned it last week, like Amari's going to see more usage in future weeks. Keon Coleman's not going to be the number 1 on this team, but then this past week we saw more good usage. Because in week 7, in that first game, he runs 83% of the routes, earns a team high 23% of the targets. He then comes out this past week, leads the team in snaps, routes run, and he ends up earning 7 targets, 2 less than Khalil Shakur, according to PFF. So all of this is great. You're still getting good usage out of Keon Coleman, who's now commanded the team high in routes run and snaps the past 2 weeks for Buffalo. And this translated to a strong performance again. 5 catches, 70 yards, a touchdown in this one. He gets 18 points, now back-to-back weeks of 18 fantasy points. And here's the deal. This isn't going to happen every week, but we're seeing a little bit of an evolution of his role. He's not just running go routes. He's getting some in-breaking routes and winning after the catch, which leads to more consistent success. If you're not familiar with Coleman, he's the Bills' second-round pick, the first pick of the second round after they traded down a couple of times out of Florida State, led Florida State in receptions and overall receiving yards. He went to Michigan State before that, did the same thing there. He actually outproduced Jaden Reed in 2023 or 2022, and he's just 21 years old. So this is a young player, and let's keep that in mind. The first 5 weeks when he's struggling, he's not meant to be a number 1 receiver in the NFL right away, right? They drafted him for that, but that's not how he is currently built as a 21-year-old who didn't really do that consistently in college. But now you add in Amari Cooper, and even though Cooper hasn't been really all that much involved based on snaps and routes run so far, in this past week he didn't do much, you add in Amari Cooper to be the number 1. I mean, just look at these pictures. Like Amari Cooper's shoulders, he just looks like the alpha in this room, right? You add in Amari Cooper to be the number 1, that naturally puts Khalil Shakur into this number 2 wide receiver position, which he had 9 targets this past week, and naturally takes a lot of pressure off of the rookie Keon Coleman to have to produce as the number 1. And what do you know? When there's pressure absolutely taken off of your shoulders and you're not overthinking things and overthinking every target coming your way when it's in the air and you drop it, now there's less pressure because you don't have to be leaned on as the guy. That's now Amari Cooper. That's why they traded for him. Now, back-to-back weeks, Keon Coleman is producing just like that when the pressure is off. And I know every week Keon Coleman's not going to go for 18 plus points, and Amari Cooper is not going to only score 1 point, right? Obviously, Amari Cooper in future weeks is going to outproduce in probably most weeks Keon Coleman, but we at least now know that Keon Coleman is gaining success and having success and just developing, and that's what we want to see out of rookies, and that's why I believe you should add him. Especially because his end-of-year schedule, like these next 2 weeks he gets the Bills at home and the Colts. Those are good matchups, but let's scroll to his playoff schedule. The Rams, that's an amazing matchup. The Lions, that sounds like a lot of points, and then in the fantasy championship week, you're going to see either, depending on when your championship is, the Patriots or the Jets, which isn't the greatest matchup, but of course I trust Josh Allen to get my guys the ball. So if you had to flex in a deeper league, Keon Coleman, you're definitely doing it against the Rams, definitely doing it against the Lions, and you feel good about doing it against the Patriots. So I'd be adding Keon Coleman, and now we have to talk about this next wide receiver room. And that's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, because Mike Evans is done for at least 3 more weeks, and Chris Godwin is done for the season. So there was a lot of talk, okay, last week, Jalen McMillan is an ad, Trey Palmer, second-year player, these guys are ads. Okay, what do we do with the young or the older veteran and Sterling Shepard, who's been playing a lot? Well, we got some answers this past week, and honestly, not a lot good here. Jalen McMillan was not used in the slot where we wanted to see him used in that Chris Godwin role. He did earn 7 targets and 1 carry, but he didn't really do too much with them. Trey Palmer was used primarily on the outside, just 2 targets. Sterling Shepard saw, honestly, like the best role. He saw 4 targets. He ended up getting hurt his hamstring in the 3rd quarter, so that kind of halted a lot of his day. And then a bunch of other fill-ins. Ryan Miller, he filled in for Sterling Shepard at points when Shepard was hurt, and then Raheem Jarrett had a big catch down the sideline. This is all really to say that there was no standout wide receiver here. Like, I'm still betting on McMillan because he's the younger guy earning 15 targets these past 2 weeks, but his role is not great on the outside. That's really not where he won his last year in college as a slot receiver. So if you're asking me today who I would rather have rest of season, I reluctantly say Jalen McMillan. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't want to start any of these dudes right now. Mike Evans is going to be back in 3 weeks. I think the best advice I can give you in this room is try and buy low on Mike Evans, because the rest of these dudes just aren't dudes in my opinion. I think McMillan, if you spent $40 or $50 on your waiver wire, you extremely overpaid for a guy you should have spent 10 to 15, but you probably couldn't get him if you did that, so I get it. I don't really want any of these guys. Sterling Shepard's going to have 5 or 6 targets a game. The rest of these guys are going to have 5 or 6. Whoever scores the touchdown has a decent week the next 2 weeks, but I'm trying to buy low on Mike Evans. I think this room is just gross right now. One guy you really need to be adding, though, is Ricky Pearsall, who we discussed him last week because there was injuries also to the 49ers wide receiver room. Brandon Ayuk went down for the year. Juwan Jennings was not practicing, and he did not play this past week either. And then Deebo Samuel's dealing with pneumonia, ended up playing in week 8, but he suffered another injury as well. So now we're looking at Ricky Pearsall, the rookie first-round pick, who's a great player out of Florida State, can run routes, can get open both on the outside and in the slot. He's looking like a priority ad once again. Pearsall's available in over 70% of leagues still, somehow. I don't know how. He ended up playing this past week 40 snaps, ran 24 routes, earned 4 targets, and he also had a carry. And that carry is important because that translated to a really big gain, 39-yard gain. He ends up in this one with catching all 4 passes, 38 yards receiving, 39 rushing, 11.7 fantasy day against Dallas. This was pretty good. And here's the thing. This was in a game where we knew the 49ers did not want to pass the ball a lot. They were without Juwan Jennings, without Brandon Ayuk, had a sick Deebo Samuel, a banged up George Kittle with a foot. They did not want to pass the ball a lot against Dallas. They wanted to lean on their run because that's where Dallas struggles. And as you can see right here last night, they ended up totaling 36 carries in this game. And you scroll up to their passing, they only had 26 pass attempts in this game. So they obviously were leaning on the run, which is why when you see 4 targets for Ricky Pearsall, doesn't sound like a lot, but it was a 16% target share. You add in his carry, he was seeing 20% of this team's overall wide receiver touches. Like, that is something that is noteworthy for a rookie. So now we've seen some nice usage out of Ricky Pearsall, who, reminder, is still just a first-round rookie. He's only played 2 games in the NFL and is literally still probably getting over mentally and physically being shot in the chest this offseason. So we entered Sunday's game against Dallas, and we knew that Deebo Samuel was going to be active, but it wasn't really sure how healthy he'd be. I mean, he was just a week removed, or days removed, from having fluid in his lungs, but in this game, we also then see Deebo Samuel goes down with an injury of his own, not the illness, right? This is something completely different. He ended up leaving the game and was dealing with a rib injury. Now, he did not return in this game, at least based on reports, he did not return in this game, and based on me using my eyes, so he did not return. He was dealing with a rib injury in this one, so this is something that we have to monitor now moving forward as well, because they're already down Brandon Ayuk. Juwan Jennings is banged up. Deebo is sick and banged up, so the wide receiver room is completely open for the taking. And that's where Ricky Pearsall comes in, somebody who is still available, as I said, in 70% of leagues. Despite us talking about him last week, this first-round pick, talented wide receiver who I mentioned can win it in the slot and out wide out of Florida is somebody you need to start taking very seriously. Because if we pull up his college profile right here, first couple of years at Arizona State didn't do much. Then he transfers to Florida, has the best year of his career, averaging 20 yards per catch. Then he plays with Anthony Richardson last year, averages 15 yards per catch, has a nice year, 965 yards, a 23% target share. All these numbers, like he doesn't crack 1,000 yards, he has a 23% target share, it's not elite like 30%. All of them might not impress you, but based on the offense he was playing in, and you know Anthony Richardson, you know the guy who could barely compete 40 or 50% of his passes right now, that's who he was playing with last year, and having these numbers, Ricky Pearsall is damn impressive. And then he goes to the NFL Combine and he runs a 4.41 40 time, so he shows elite 92nd percentile speed according to player profile. And look at this right here. His burst score 98th percentile, his agility 97th, his catch radius 98th percentile. You saw this on his 39-yard run. This is a guy who's very agile, he's very nimble, he's very dynamic, and he's a guy who's only going to get better the more reps he has in the NFL. He's already like a pro. He's a rookie who's a pro, and he just needs more reps. So add Ricky Pearsall, and then a quick hitter to talk about here. Christian Watson's available in over 50% of leagues. This is a guy, the only reason I want to mention him is because right here, according to PFF, he saw a season high in snaps. He played 52 snaps, more snaps than Jaden Reed here. He runs 23 routes. He's six targets, a team high. So all that's good. So he's seeing more usage than Jaden Reed, but this is the Packers wide receiver room. Kind of bounces around by the week, and now Jordan Love is dealing with a groin injury and could miss 1 to 2 games. So overall, Christian Watson was available available in like 55% of leagues. I think it's worth bringing up, but as we've seen in past weeks, some weeks it's Romeo Doubs the last 2 weeks, then it's Jaden Reed for most of the season before that. Sometimes Dontavian Wicks takes over, right? So I think Watson should not be on waivers. He's a guy who could be a flex option for you, but just kind of temper your expectations. The next guy we can talk about here, Tyler Algier. I just want to keep bringing him up because there wasn't a lot of running backs worth adding this past week. Really, no running backs got hurt. No role changes really happened here. But Tyler Algier, he's still available in over 70% of leagues. He's still a guy who's seeing 12 carries compared to Bijan seeing 13. Now, obviously, Bijan has the receiving game role. You can see here, 6 catches, 37 yards, finds the end zone. So he picks up another 15 yards as a receiver or 15 fantasy points. Tyler Algier doesn't have that. But what Tyler Algier does have is 2 years of proven success, one with Bijan, one without. So if anything happens to Bijan, you're probably looking at a spot where Tyler Algier starts to see, instead of 12 carries, 18 to 20 carries a week in this offense. The next situation I just want to touch in on here, another backfield situation, since not a lot of running backs to really be adding overall, is Blake Corum. We still know Kyren Williams is the clear RB1. He saw another 20 plus touches this past week on Thursday Night Football, but the only running back to see a snap, Ronnie Rivers, has been phased out, right? Ronnie Rivers, who was playing ahead of Blake Corum the first 4 to 5 weeks of the season, he's been phased out now because for the second straight game, Blake Corum 7 snaps. Blake Corum in this game 4 carries and a target. That's nothing crazy, right? 23 carries for Kyren Williams and 6 targets. Like, he's still the workhorse. But if anything happens to Kyren, who's had 3 ankle/foot injuries in his first 2.5 years in the league, Blake Corum looks like the guy who would take over. Now, I got to talk about this next guy just because I got so many questions leading into the week, and I said, like, no, he's not worth adding. He's not worth rostering. He's not worth anything. And then it started to look like maybe that was a bad idea because out of nowhere, Rico Dowdle gets ruled out with an illness, and Dalvin Cook now, people are like, oh, Dalvin Cook's going to steal the show. He's going to be the guy. He's going to be so good. Not so fast. Dalvin Cook couldn't even outsnap Ezekiel Elliott, who we know based on the usage and how he's looked on film this year is complete dust. Dalvin Cook goes out there, has 6 carries, looks absolutely terrible on them, averaging 2 yards a carry, has 1 catch for 10 yards. That was the best thing he did all night. Dalvin Cook is not somebody worth adding. I know on a week where there's not a lot of running backs to add and Dalvin Cook has the name value, you're going to want to add him. Dalvin Cook is not better than Ezekiel Elliott right now, and that's saying something because Ezekiel Elliott is not great. So even if Dalvin Cook is available in your league, he's not worth adding. Rico Dowdle was not even in this game. Rico Dowdle is the best running back, the RB1 on this team. He missed with an illness. He's going to be back in all the future games this season. Dalvin Cook couldn't even get anything done with him out of the lineup. You think Dalvin Cook's going to do anything? And don't tell me it was the 49ers. The 49ers this year have been average against the run. So don't waste your time on Dalvin Cook. And I would tell you to temper your expectations on Mike Gesicki. I know the Bengals tight end had a big week on National Tight End Day. All the tight ends went off, 7 catches, 73 yards on 8 targets, right? He ends up having 13.3 fantasy points. But here's the thing about this. They were trailing all game to Philadelphia, not something the Bengals will do most weeks, and T. Higgins was out. We've seen earlier this year when T. Higgins was out, they relied on Mike Gesicki more. I don't know if I said Evans earlier, but Mike Gesicki is not somebody you can rely on because T. Higgins is likely to be back next week, and then Gesicki goes back to having 2 or 3 targets and not playing as many snaps because he does not know how to pass protect or run block, so he comes off the field. So in passing game scripts like this past week when there was no T. Higgins and they needed to come back against Philadelphia, Mike Gesicki sees more usage. But odds are this is the best performance that he'll have the rest of the season. 7 for 73 on 8 targets if I had to bet myself, so maybe not somebody worth adding him and Dalvin Cook. So now these have been the players heading into week 8 that you need to add this week right now in your fantasy league. A couple of league winners in this video for sure. And if you want to see the players that you should be trading for this week, well, those videos will pop up right here, both the running backs and wide receivers when they're out later this week. Be sure to hit the subscribe button before you go, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one.